There were 8 NFL head coaches that were just hired in this most recent NFL head coaching cycle, so today, let's grade them. Now, these are going to be in order from my least favorite hire to my most favorite hired, and of course, we're going to be using an A+ to an F- scale. So without further ado, let's get to my 8th ranked hire of this cycle, and then it's going to be Brian Callahan, the new Tennessee Titans head coach. Now, when it comes to connections, it's hard to say that Brian Callahan doesn't have the connections you'd want as a head coach, but my whole thing with the Brian Callahan hire is the simple fact that you had Mike Vrabel, and listen, I know Mike Vrabel has his deniers and haters, but at the same time, he's arguably a top 10 head coach. This is a guy who took this team to the playoffs with Ryan Tannehill at the quarterback position, and now you have Brian Callahan, who's coming from the Cincinnati Bengals, and while he did a very good job of having an innovative offense with the Cincinnati Bengals, he's now going to a system with not a lot of pieces that he'd probably want to have. In Cincinnati, he had a good defense to go along with Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, and Tyler Boyd, and of course, Joe Burrow. Now he's going to be entering a team with a horrible offensive line, now a suspect defense, to go along with question marks in both the quarterback room and the receiving room. Listen, I love Will Levis, but to compare Will Levis to Joe Burrow is simply insane. So for Brian Callahan, he's going to have to overcome, in my opinion, a big obstacle. I think for this hire, he's going to have an extremely long leash, because if he wants to maximize what he can do in Tennessee, he's going to have to take at least 3 to 4 years to really fix this roster. Whereas, had they just kept Mike Vrabel, I think 1, maybe 2 years of rebuilding could have done the job. I mean, under Mike Vrabel, the defense was playing fine, the offense was overperforming given how much problems they have personnel-wise. And me personally, I think it's just a shame they fired him the second they finally got their quarterback. So yes, I'm going to give this grade a D. Let us now move on to my number 7 ranked hire, and that is going to be Dan Quinn to the Washington Commanders. Now, when it comes to a defensive-minded head coach who I'd want to come in and basically completely overhaul my defense, I don't think there's a better hire out there than maybe Dan Quinn, because the one thing I will say about Dan Quinn is that as a pure defensive coordinator, he's arguably one of the best out there. This is the same defensive coordinator who coached the Legion of Boom and then most recently had Micah Parsons going crazy with the Dallas Cowboys. But my issue for this is that, well, Washington doesn't have the personnel right away to have a Dan Quinn style defense. And when it comes to the offensive side of things, there's a lot of question marks with Dan Quinn. For starters, when he was the Atlanta Falcons head coach, his most successful year was when Kyle Shanahan was there. Of course, they would go on to make it to a Super Bowl and blow a 28-3 lead, but that is a good successful season, all things considered. But outside of those Kyle Shanahan years, that offense was never the same. And with Dan Quinn being a defensive-minded head coach in an offensive-minded league, I just have a lot of question marks about this hire. And to me, this move just feels a little bit uninspiring. At the end of the day, you just fired Ron Rivera, who's also a defensive-minded head coach, for another established defensive coordinator who's already been I don't want to say failure of a head coach, but not necessarily a successful head coach. To me, going from Ron Rivera to Dan Quinn is very similar. Even though I do think Dan Quinn is a better defensive coordinator, I still think there's a lot of question marks out there. And when there's already better head coaches available, guys like Bobby Slowick, Ben Johnson, and of course Mike Vrabel, I just feel like this hire is extremely questionable. Again, I do think Dan Quinn can do some nice things for this defense, but I don't like the hire. I do think there's going to be too many questions to answer, so I'm going to give this grade a C-. Let's go ahead and move on to the 6th ranked head coach of this head coaching cycle, and for me, it's going to be Jerod Mayo, the new New England Patriots head coach. Now, what I will say about Jerod Mayo is I do think that it is a very fun hire for the New England Patriots. To hire a head coach who is a former player that used to play on your team that has also been working underneath Bill Belichick for several years to become the successor for him, it sounds like a good story. But to me, there's a lot of questions to be asked. For starters, is he head coach material? We're talking about a guy who's never been an offensive coordinator or a defensive coordinator or a head coach in this league. And yes, he's really been working with Bill Belichick these past couple seasons, but how much has he actually been working? Has he been sitting in that office with Bill Belichick every single day? I don't have the answers to that, I just genuinely do wonder. But I think the big question for me comes to this: is he really a big change when it comes to this Patriots team? For me, I felt like this Patriots team needed a completely new overhaul of branding, not because Bill Belichick ruined it, but just the simple fact that Bill Belichick has been the brand for several years, and now you're bringing in a guy who is a little bit questionable when it comes to how big he can be. Can he truly be a guy who completely changes the dynamic of that locker room? I don't know. And again, because he's been working with Bill Belichick and because he's been under Bill Belichick basically his entire career, I just don't know how big of a change we're actually going to see. Now, I'll say this: This grade right now is a little bit lower, but if they get one guy in particular, and that is Jayden Daniels, I think I'll give this grade a little bit higher of a grade, but that isn't because I think Jayden Daniels is a better player than guys like Caleb Williams or Drake May, but I think if you get a guy like Jayden Daniels into that Patriots locker room, that will actually change the team moving forward. I think if they go out there and get a guy like a Drake May, I think you'll see a lot more of the same from the New England Patriots, and that's both for better and for worse. We'll just have to wait to see. So for me, I kind of stand right in the middle. I'm gonna give this grade a solid C. Now let's go ahead and move on to my 5th ranked ranked hire of this most recent head coaching cycle, and that is going to be Raheem Morris, the new Atlanta Falcons head coach. Raheem Morris has been to 2 different places to be their head coach. He was obviously the head coach for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers between 2009 to 2011, and then after Dan Quinn was fired from the Atlanta Falcons, he was actually their interim head coach. And after his most recent stint as the defensive coordinator for the LA Rams, he is now the new head coach for the Atlanta Falcons. And to be honest with you, I think this is a very good hire. I think for him, he's actually in a very nice situation with a team that is full of talent both offensively and defensively. And when you look at the actual personnel on the defense, I actually think it matches up very nicely to what Raheem Morris is going to want to do for that defense. And offensively speaking, the simple fact that he's already poached away guys like Zach Robinson from the LA Rams to be his new offensive coordinator, I think is a very good move. You're going to bring that LA Rams culture into a team like Atlanta, who's right on the brink of being a very good team. I think it's a good move for both sides. For Atlanta, you're getting a fairly young coach who has a lot of experience, who's going to bring in a Super Bowl mentality. And for Raheem Morris, you're going to a team that already has the guys who can compete right away. So for me, my really only question that I really have is what happens after Zach Robinson potentially leaves, and it's going to be up to Raheem Morris to find a successor for him as the offensive coordinator. But when it comes to the next 1 to 2 years, I really have no questions. I think Raheem Morris is going to be a very good head coach for this team, so I'm going to give this one a solid B. Now we are working on the upper half of this list. Let's talk about the number 4, and it's going to be Antonio Pierce, the retained head coach of the Las Vegas Raiders. And I think this is a very good hire. The simple fact that he went 5-4 after Josh McDaniel was gone is very impressive. And that game against Kansas City, in my opinion, basically secured him the head coaching spot moving forward. AP, in one night of being the head coach, completely changed the entire culture and dynamic of the Raiders team. That was almost a dictatorship under Josh McDaniels, and now with Antonio Pierce, you have guys smoking cigars in the locker room, which is just so Las Vegas Raiders-like. To me, he's just someone who gets it. He understands what it means to be the Las Vegas Raiders head coach, and I think he's going to do a hell of a job. Now, I do have some questions. For starters, he isn't really an experienced coach in this league. I think he's only been a coach for like 6-7 years at this point. And now this is going to be his first time as the official head coach of an actual team, not the interim, but the official. I think a big part of his success is going to be who he hires as his offensive and defensive coordinators. If he gets a successful offensive coordinator to fill in that spot, I think there's going to be some good things happening for that Las Vegas team, because talent-wise, there's already a ton of talent on that Raiders roster. It really just needs a couple generals to fill in some certain spots and get that team rolling in the right direction. But I think the number one thing he has to do is get a quarterback. Going into next year with Aiden O'Connell or Jimmy Garoppolo as your starting quarterback is going to be bad news for Antonio Pierce. He needs to have a new franchise quarterback so that he has at least 3 to 4 years to work with. I'm just going to throw that name out there, but Justin Fields is going to be potentially available. Antonio Pierce, make a move. But for this grade, I'm going to give it a B+. Let us now move on to the 3rd ranked hire of this most recent head coaching cycle. It is going to be Jim Harbaugh to the LA Chargers. Now, I'll be completely transparent on my thoughts on this hire. At first, I thought this was going to be a bad hire, but then as time has gone on, I've actually kind of grown into the hiring. In fact, if you go back on my page just several months ago, or maybe weeks ago, I'm not too sure, I actually made a video on the LA Chargers and I said that I did not like Jim Harbaugh to that team, but I actually do want to retract that statement. I do think it is a good hire. You want to talk about a guy who's going to completely change that offense, it's Jim Harbaugh. He is going to make Justin Herbert's life 10 times easier. The days of Herbert having to be Superman in order to win games are basically gone. And when it comes to it, Jim Harbaugh has the connections with Michigan and so many other places that he's going to be able to find guys who can fill in certain spots in this coaching staff. Let's look at Mike McDonald, who I haven't mentioned yet, but he's going to be talked about here in a second, who is originally from Michigan, who's now a head coach in this league because of how good of a coordinator he was. Jim Harbaugh will be able to find guys who can fill in certain spots, and I think when it comes to Jim Harbaugh himself, he is a perfect fit with what the LA Chargers are going to do. The Chargers have sort of been known for their pass game and not necessarily their run game, but now with Jim Harbaugh, that's going to completely change. Now, I think there's 2 ways this goes. Either this works incredibly well or this works incredibly bad. And I'll tell you the incredibly bad part first. For starters, I don't think the personnel right away is going to match what Jim Harbaugh wants to do. As it sits right now, your starting running back is Austin Eckler, and of course you also have Joshua Kelly, but neither one of those guys are really that pounded down your throat running back that of course Jim Harbaugh likes to have. The good news for Harbaugh is that he has a certain running back named Blake Corum going into this year's draft that I guarantee you the LA Chargers are going to absolutely want to get, but that also isn't my only concern. My other concern is the offensive line and of course the receiving room. We're talking about a team that is, I want to say, like negative $50 million in cap space, so they're going to have a ton of cap casualties. And I think when it comes down to it, with Justin Herbert, you're kind of stuck in a spot where you basically have to compete because you have Herbert, but I almost feel like this is a Chargers team that should almost suck for 1 or 2 more years so they can kind of rebuild this roster around Justin Herbert. But if they all buy in and they all build the identity around Jim Harbaugh, this thing can be special, dude. If they run with the identity of what Michigan ran away with Jim Harbaugh, it can get really good. So with the assumption assumption that everyone's going to buy in and they actually make the proper moves in the coaching staff, I'm going to give Jim Harbaugh a great grade of a letter A. Let us now move into our top 2, and number 2 is going to be Dave Canales, the new head coach for the Carolina Panthers. And the reason why this is such a high grade is, in my opinion, if there was one guy in this new cycle who can completely go in there and rebrand Bryce Young and what he is moving forward, it is Dave Canales. He's worked under guys like Pete Carroll down there in Seattle, where he was helping guys like Geno Smith and, of course, Drew Lock. And in his most recent year as the offensive coordinator for the Buccaneers, he rebuilt and rebranded Baker Mayfield. Well, now he has to do that with another player who, in my opinion, is the most talented of them all, and that is Bryce Young. He gets to build an offense around a, in my opinion, franchise-level quarterback in Bryce Young, and he basically has a clean slate. When it comes to contracts, they don't really have anybody on the offensive side of things who's going to take up a ton of cap space moving forward, so they'll be able to find ways to get money on this offense to find good players to surround Bryce Young with. I'm talking about you, T. Higgins. Please come to Carolina. And for Dave Canales to fill in that new offensive coordinator spot, I think is a great fit with a guy like Bryce Young. Now, of course, there's always going to be concerns when it comes to a first-year head coach. We're talking about a guy who's only been an offensive coordinator for a handful of years, and of course, has never been the guy for a new team. I think it's going to be interesting to see how he develops his roster and how he develops the coaching staff around him. If I was Dave Canales, I'd bring in experienced guys to surround an inexperienced head coach. Guys like Ron Rivera would make a ton of sense for Carolina, and as a whole, I would want to bring in as much experience around me as a head coach so that I know where I'm going moving forward. Imagine getting advice from a guy like Ron Rivera, who was the former head coach for the Carolina Panthers. I think it makes a ton of sense. Not saying he should be the defensive coordinator, but I just want to throw that out there. I think for Dave Canales, you have one simple job: make Bryce Young work, and if that's the case, if you can do that, you're going to be the head coach for that team for many, many years. So as you guys can tell, I'm very high on this hire. I'm going to give it a solid A. Let's now move on to my number 1 hire of this most recent head coaching cycle. It is going to be Mike Macdonald, the new head coach for the Seattle Seahawks. I think it's very simple. The Seattle Seahawks needed a new face to run the franchise. Under Pete Carroll, they were one of the most successful teams of this most recent decade, but it did seem like this team needed a bit of a new identity. And if you want a new identity, getting a guy like Mike Macdonald might be the best one. In my opinion, of all the head coaches that were hired, I think that he is the best defensive coordinator. I know what I said about Dan Quinn, but I think Dan Quinn is good at fixing defenses. I think Mike Macdonald is good at being a defensive coordinator. Hopefully that makes sense, but if it doesn't, I can explain more in the comments. And for Mike Macdonald, your job is very simple. You have got to fix this defense, because offensively speaking, you have a lot to like. You have talent on the offensive line, great receiving core, and a quarterback who's very capable. And on the defensive side of things, you have talent on the table. So for Mike Macdonald, the job shouldn't be too hard. Go in there, overhaul the defense, fix what you need to fix the schemes, fix the personnel, just do whatever you need to do and get it right. I think if he does that, this Seattle Seahawks team can be damn good. And the thing about it is, I fully expect him to be able to do that because, well, he's been a successful defensive coordinator wherever he's been. You look at that Ravens defense, which by the way is super talented, but at the end of the day, he's turned some guys who weren't thought to be that talented and turned them into all-star level players. Imagine what he could do with guys like Devon Witherspoon. I think it could be incredible. Now, I do have some concerns on the offensive side of things for Mike Macdonald, but I do think if he brings in the right offensive coordinator, I'm not too worried about it. But I think for Seattle, you got the guy who's going to fix your defense, and I think the rest will fall into place. I like this hire a ton. So of course, with him being my number 1 hire, you gotta expect it. I'm giving him an A+. But you guys tell me, do you guys agree with my list? And if not, let me know your grades in the comment section below. And if you enjoyed, hit the like and subscribe button. But I love you guys. Peace.